方案，
这样应该是可以。
那我需要带带子。
呃，
那个人他会追踪老师，
对，这要是
可以改更这一块跟他出现的影响了。对的。
画面这个
嗯，
还录得到声音，刚刚不是的。
对。
跟到变到，哎，跟到我，没有，我们先离开。可以买我。抓到你，被谁抓？对对。
就跟跟外负责。
两个字，这个不用把它。好，各位老师、各位同学，大家好。那我们今天很开心可以邀请到丘雨勤老师来做分享。那我先简单的介绍一下丘雨勤老师。丘雨勤老师他现在是我们成大心理系的客座教授。那同时呢，他是 Purdue 的老师，在美国的普渡大学。那其实我跟邱老师认识很久了，就是我们大学大一的时候就是同班同学，到现在。那邱老师他非常非常的优秀，所以我们大一推甄的时候就进到台大心理系，然后刚刚才在聊，就是我们是同一个 lab 出来的，所以我们的指导教授都是业余老师。那个时候是我们看到那个叶老师有在征那个工读生，要帮老师做实验，然后我们两个同时都去老师的实验室做实验，那就在那个时候我们一起 work on same project， 然后一起做研究，然后做到后来我们那篇文章后来也有发表，是我们应该是都是我们两个第一篇文章啦，是在那个 visual cognition。那篇的引用其实还引用蛮多的，其实在谈那个 attention 在这个visual working memory， 特别是在做 feature binding 扮演的一个重要的角色。那后来邱老师他没有在台大继续念书，所以他是申请到这个美国Johns Hopkins 去念跟 neuroscience 相关。那他是拿到台湾的公费留学奖学金，然后过去的。那在 Johns Hopkins， 邱老师跟的指导教授是 Steven Yantes， 那他是在做这个注意力里面非常重要的很重要的一个研究者。那如果大家有看这个注意力相关的研究，在谈这个 contingent capture hypothesis 的时候，其实 Steven 他在这个 top down bottom up 里面的论述里面扮演很重要的角色。那在 Steven Onnis 后来晚期的时候，做了很多是跟这个 reward 相关的 reward driven 的 attention capture。那我想邱老师应该过去也有follow 这样子的一个 track， 做很多 attention 相关的研究。那其实邱老师除了在行为上面做很多的理论的研究之外，他也做很多 neuroscience 的研究，所以包括使用 fMRI 的技术，或者是一些 neuromodulation 的技术，这个都是邱老师很擅长专精的。那之后邱老师历经了postdoc 一段时间，那最后终于到了 Purdue， 然后也在去年升等成就是拿到 tenure 在普渡这边。那现在就是刚刚好有机会，我们请邱老师趁他 sabbatical 的时间，那我们请邱老师来这边客座。那也希望透过这样子的机会，可以让成大的同学可以跟 Purdue 这边有更多的一个连结。那我想邱老师这边有很多东西是大家可以学习的。那今天就非常谢谢邱老师可以来分享。那我们就不占用大家的时间，那我们欢迎邱雨勤老师。
谢谢正达杨教授把我的一生描述的这么仔细。对，首先看看这个会不会 work。首先先谢谢杨正达教授，不然我就不能在这边做客座。那今天也只是希望就是跟大家分享过去这几年来我自己学生的一些成果。那因为就像正达讲的，之前我出去念书的时候，其实是想要就是看 neuroscience 这一块啊，然后用比较新的一些技术方法。 但是今天呢，其实大家看到的会蛮基本的，都会归回到就是实验认知还有基本 cognitive psychology 的一些 principle。所以，但是我另外一个这几年一些感受啦是其实台湾的教育真的很扎实。我现在回想以前在大学部学的东西，我觉得台湾的老师是非常非常厉害的老师，可以把一整本的教科书教完，然后教得很仔细。虽然出国去接受不同的一些新技术啊什么，但是最根本的是当时在大学部学到的一些基础知识，才能让我就是在之后的学习上的帮助。所以希望大家就是善用你们的这边的老师的才华，所以大家上课可以认真这样。好，and I'm going to switch to English because I would not know how to present my work in Chinese. And by the way, feel free to stop me anytime and ask questions. They said it's supposed to be a 2-hour seminar, but I don't know I can talk for 2 hours straight. So if you ask question, that's a break for me. So I would appreciate that. Okay, I'll start to give you guys a framework of my recent work. We think, behavior or actions are governed by two regimes, goals and habits. And these two regimes have been supported by research that they are distinct because they are supported by very distinctive processes. Habits are thought to be driven by so-called associative learning, 有的那个expertise. And a good example is, you every day you go out for work, you come downstairs, and then turn right to go to your bus stop or MRT station. On the other hand, goal-directed behaviors or actions are thought to be supported by cognitive control. But this is still quite an umbrella term. A popular way to kind of decompose cognitive control is Miyake, Freeman, and colleagues' model that cognitive control actually have a couple subcomponent functions or processes. Selective attention, be one that most of you are probably familiar with, filtering function and updating, inhibition, so on and so forth. And to illustrate the opposing drive of action, the best example is the Stroop task. So in this kind of classic psychology task, people, when they brought into the lab, we assume they've been reading their whole life. So the automatic behavior is to, see this and then say green or 绿. But then when they are in the lab, we actually told them that, no, your goal right now is not to read. Your goal right now is actually to name the color, right? Name the ink. So they will have to say red. And then this is not so automatic, and it takes a little bit while to produce that response. And from there, we can actually see how these two regimes can drive behavior very differently. But the reason we have these two kind of drivers is because they have pros and cons. Goal-directed behaviors are flexible, but as I mentioned, they're slower to produce. Flexible in a way that I can give you a new goal, which is to count how many E's in GREN, and you can say 2, right? And then I can say how many stroke. 这个绿有几画，那你也可以告诉我有几画。So it's very flexible, but it's slower. On the other hand, habits or habitual reactions are very rigid. It's usually just that response links to the stimulus, and then it's very fast. There's nothing to think about. The recent research I've been doing is to ask this question of, can we combine the best of two regimes and have something called automatic control? It's quite a oxymoronic term. Coined by Jacobi, because control behavior is not supposed to be automatic, and automatic behavior is not supposed to be controlled, right? So, but we do see that in various places, various paradigms. And in everyday life, to be honest, it's quite ubiquitous too, right? There's a place and a time for focused attention. When you think back, when you need to prepare for entrance exam, You want to go to a place that can kind of get you into this focused attention mode quickly, right? And there's probably a place for task switching, not the focused attention, but the opposite, that you want to switch between things quickly. And from my own experience, I can definitely relate. This is when my kids, my youngest son was still 6 months old, and then I was starting a job at Purdue. I come home and then I'm busy cooking, trying to put food on the table, and he wants to play with me, right? I know you guys don't have this problem because you have Uber in your pockets, and then the dinner will be at the door in 10 minutes. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a couple studies from my lab that characterize this stimulus-driven meta-control. I'm going to give you a definition for now, but it will seem a little bit hard to grasp. But hopefully through the illustration of my studies, you'll start to appreciate this. We define this as the regulation of cognitive control achieved through repeated experiences in which specific stimuli, a place, a time, and control demands. In my example, it's mostly about task switching. These two things have frequently co-occur together. Okay, and I'll feature my 2 grad students' work. Most of about task switching, meta-control and task switching is actually, Moonsang's work. Stimulus-driven meta-control is Moonsang's work. But then I'll transition to Corey on the right, his work that's related but slightly different. Okay, and we'll start with this question. Is there a single mechanism underlying different stimulus-driven meta-control? Before we actually delve into the study, I want to give you a kind of a detailed explanation or walk through the paradigm that we use a lot throughout this talk. It's kind of the core paradigm we'll use. So it's a typical cue task switching paradigm in a way that subject come into the lab. We're gonna tell them, you're gonna see pictures on the screen, and you will do some categorization task according to the cue. So for instance, if you see a friend, color friend, in this case red, then you'll categorize the image as living or non-living. So the object in the image, so this dog is living or non-living. And then they get a feedback in the next trial. But on the other hand, if they see a color friend that's blue, then they'll have to do a different task, a larger or smaller than a shoebox task. So there'll be 2 consequences after first trial that they done the living, non-living task. The next trial could be the same task. So this is what we call a repeat trial, task repeat trial, or they could be forced to or asked to switch to a different task. And the typical finding of this kind of paradigm is very robust. Response time is longer and accuracy is lower on switch trial compared to the repeat trial. And we typically take this difference as an index of cognitive control, and a shorthand is just, it's a switch cost. Yeah. Yeah, for the talk, I make it more interesting. The other stimuli used in the experiments is a little bit more straightforward, but usually it's referring to the thing in the real world, right? And then, because sometimes the dog size depends on the expertise, so we actually don't use this kind of cute dog, but for the, to make it more interesting, right? And the car is an interesting example too, right? You think of the toy car that kids play with, but it could actually be a real size, because I searched that, and then you could actually find a real size car like a cartoon Lightning McQueen model, and that actually exists like for kids. Okay, so in the first study I'm going to show you, we start with this question. Is there a single mechanism underlying different kinds of stimulus-driven control? And the reason is because in the literature, we already knew there are at least very similar 2 or 3 different kinds of the meta-control we've been referring to. The first is something called the list-wise effect. So Dreisbach and other people have shown in their other studies asking a little bit different question that you can find reduced switch costs in a list, which is just a block of trials with frequent switches, than in list with frequent repeats. Okay, so this is later on we refer as a list-wise effect. And in my last postdoc, I also extend this to the item level. So the dog, the car you saw earlier, we want to know, if we tie the switch probability manipulation to the item, can we also see that effect at item level? So that's what we did. And we found that you can, again, observe reduced switch cost in items frequently appearing on switch trial compared to those items frequently appearing more on repeat trial. On those items, you'll still have switch repeat trials. It's just the probability differences. So if there is a single mechanism for these 2 effects, and I'll show you in later on that behaviorally, they really seems like a very similar thing. We should see a correlation between the 2 across subjects. So far, no one has done it within subjects, so that's our very first kind of attempt to do it. I tend to talk a little bit fast, so please let me know if I need to slow down. Okay, so in this study, again, we take our very basic task switching paradigm and we manipulate item-specific switch probability such that some of the item, actually half of the item, have 20% switches, and the other half of the item have 80% switches. What that means is that if you see this chair, 8 out of 10 trials, it's actually on the repeat scenario. On the other hand, for the car, 8 out of 10 trials, it's on the switch scenario. Okay, and lo and behold, we replicated, yes. Okay. So lo and behold, we're able to replicate the item-specific effect that the switch cost is reduced in items that are associated with higher probability of switches compared to items that are associated with lower probability of switches. So on the y-axis is switch cost, and throughout this talk, the y-axis are usually, I think it's all switch cost. In addition to this block, this kind of block, so to point out the half and half is because that means overall it's actually 50%. So people would actually experience a regular kind of task switching paradigm because typically it's half and half, and nothing that we tell them about this item specific thing. They have to actually through experiencing different trials and pick that up. Okay, here I'm plotting the interaction effect, but if you want to know the more complex 2x2 ANOVA, basically main effect of transition is significant, no main effect of items, but the interaction was significant. It's not a big effect, it's only 11.2 milliseconds, but so far we found it pretty robust across studies and slightly different stimuli. Okay. And in terms of what this behavior effect reflect, we think it's reflecting something more reactive in terms of the onset of the mechanism, because as I point out, the blocks contain half of the low probability items and the high items. Subject cannot anticipate what kind of items are coming up next trial. So the only reason we would see this effect is only after the onset of the item, only after they recognize the car, the chair, then somehow their cognitive system were able to use that information, this information that likely implicitly learned, and then affect their performance. Okay. In addition to this kind of block, we also give them 2 additional blocks. And now we are manipulating the switch probability at the list level now, at the block level. We take the bias item and then put them in each of the trial list or blocks, but we also have half of the items that are not biased in any way. So there will be new items that are associated with 50% of switches. So here, what we're showing here is that even on those items that are 50% overall, you can still see a reduction of switch cost because of the probability biases at the list level. Okay. And this is a contrast to what I said, like the item level thing. We think that the reason we'll also see this pattern is because the mechanism is more proactive. Participants are probably treating every trial in the same list similarly. They just adopting this high switch versus low switch probability kind of processing mode, such that even the unbiased one can kind of enjoy the benefit of overall, I should be in a switch state versus overall, I should be in a task repeat state. Okay. Right, so those are still kind of replication of previous findings, but the key, we want to see whether there's a correlation between the two or not. And as we actually expected not to see a correlation, so here we do not see a correlation between these two effects. Although, if you're a cognitive psychologist, you probably will be asking, are these measurements really reliable? You're getting nothing here. Maybe there's confounding, there's reasons that they're not correlated. And one reason could be that these are kind of differences score. How reliable is this kind of measurement? Right. So to address that, we then look at more basic switch cost effect across blocks and look at split half effect of each of the index, list-wise and list-wise. And on all those, we can find a correlation between the subject's measurement of the two and then correlation between them. So that would suggest at least each of these index is somewhat reliable on its own, but the lack of correlation is probably reflecting the actual relationship. Okay, so again, are these findings replicable? So to answer this, we conducted a second study, and things do replicate. The only difference is slight kind of experimental details. In the very first experiment, we actually use all the response incongruent items. I'll get into what response incongruent meant much later on, but for now, anyone who kind of familiar with this will kind of recognize. But anyway, reviewer actually didn't like this idea, and then they asked us to kind of do both. So we revert to the more basic or more traditional is having both type of items. But the overall findings still replicate and uphold. Okay, so with this behavioral study, hopefully I show you that there's at least two kinds of stimulus-driven meta-control, a list-wise effect reflecting something perhaps more proactive, item-specific flavor that's more reactive, and we think that they are driven by dissociable mechanisms. This was actually Moon-san's first year project, and the goal was to build this up and then do an FMI study on this. But then COVID happened, so she didn't get to do this until kind of 2 years after her first year project. And she was only able to kind of include this in her dissertation. And even the analysis was still quite raw, kind of crude, but at least showing just the main effects of these different manipulation, it seems that different neural substrates are driving the effects because there's no overlapping neural substrates. When we run the conjunction, there's no overlapping aspect. Okay. All right, so for the next one, I'm going to talk about a different, slightly related but different aspect. How does top-down processing modulate stimulus-driven meta-control. Okay. On the first study, I show you that you can induce this kind of meta-control through experience. As I said, we didn't tell them what we are manipulating. We assume they learn it, implicitly learning, and by what, right? We think it's through experience, through going through these trials and then having those experiences. But the question of meta-control is actually can be in different forms. So for example, in our, or you guys too, in your so-called participant pool, oftentimes we have this list of studies. And when subjects go and find which study they want to be part of, they are choosing what kind of control state they want to be in, right? Do they want to do a lot of switching, or do they want to get into like emotion regulation or working memory, things like that, assuming they are taking 普心，然后对这些 concept 有一些概念。So to some extent, you can also ask people to be in certain state and then produce that kind of control state. And that's what I refer to as kind of expectation-driven meta-control. And in this project, we want to look at the interaction of these two, kind of contrasting something that's more stimulus, bottom up, with something that's intentional, top down and explicit. Okay. So again, we're going to take our basic paradigm that has the item-specific switch probability manipulation and then tweak it a little bit. In this study, we changed kind of the trial progression, the pre-stimulus part. So instead of a simple fixation, here they'll see a screen for quite a while, 1200 milliseconds, and they will see this prepare cue. And then as what they should prepare depends. It will depend on so-called a mini block instructions that we provide them. On some of the blocks, we actually tell them that, hey, you're going to have a lot of switch trials. So when you see the prepare, get yourself ready. Prepare for the frequent switches, ready to switch to the other rule. And then from then on, 40 trials will follow, and each of the trial will have this prepare cue. So that's what they should be doing, but there's no response required. There's nothing we're really checking them, but just say, when you see the prepare, get ready for this frequent switches. The other kind of, however, it's fake because overall it's 50%, 20%, 80%, but half of these, half of that. So overall, doing those 40 trials, it's 50%. It's not really higher switches, right? So that's why it's kind of fake in that sense. The contrasting condition is the frequent repeat one. So here we told them that when you see the prepare cue, now just relax. Now expect the next trial to be the same task as your previous trial, and you can kind of just go with the flow. I mean, don't have to be like ready for switches. Okay, and then they kind of alternate between these mini blocks back and forth a couple times. So here's what we found, a little bit disappointing. Basically, we kind of got rid of our ISSP effect that I claim to be robust. But after the experiment, we kind of feel like it's expected. We're kind of shooting ourselves on the foot by saying that prepare for switches, prepare for no switches. So to some extent, this is what we expect. It's this same trend, but not significant. And then if you compare the magnitude of the switch cost from our previous study, you'll see that this is much smaller. Like I said, we kind of told them to be in this hyper prepare mode. So therefore, every trial is probably kind of switches to them, or I kind of high cognitive demanding trials. So switch costs are overall smaller. But that's okay, because the reason we have this design is, especially the prepare screen, is because we're going to use EEG. So this allows us to still look at that period of processing and see if there's any differences across conditions, and kind of get a sense of what's going on when people are doing our task. Okay, so just using this complicated graph, but to kind of look at the data. So the idea is that, we're using different time period to kind of make inferences of what's going on. From the beginning of the prepare queue, we can look at the brainwave time locks to the prepare queue and see how that differ between the conditions. And this should reflect what we said, the proactive, a little bit more expectation-driven meta-control. And then by the time the item onset, as I said, if there's ISSP effect, it's reactive. So from there, we can then look at whether item people will have this different processing differences because of the different items. Okay, so if we look at the Q-lock ERP, we were able to find differences. Most of you guys heard of EEG maybe, but anyway, so these are the brainwave time lock to the onset of the Q. And it was till a little bit later that we start to see differences between the two conditions. And this looks a little bit like the CMV, if anyone knew the EEG literature. But again, the paradigm itself is not designed to evoke CMV. But the key is that we were able to see some difference evoked by the Q, kind of demonstrating that there were some state differences that was instantiated by participants. Okay. And then if we look at the item locked ERP, we were also able to see differences. Here I'm showing you something called a difference wave. So it's already a switch minus repeat. But the key is to see whether there'll be differences between the items. Because the idea is that through this learning, people should be able to differentiate these two items and kind of process them differently. And luckily, we were able to see this effect. Okay. The time range is a little bit late, which is very close to response. And it's kind of what we would expect. But currently, I also have some undergrad helping me to see if we can kind of decode the earlier time period, because we think that the reason we would, if the ISSP effect is robust, they should be able to start telling the difference from pretty early on of the trial, not so late. Okay, questions? Bob? Right. So yeah, she was also able to find a correlation between the behavior effect and EEG effects, but that's okay. Well, I'll elaborate this next study. So it's disappointing that we didn't see the behavior effect in our first study. So in her second study, we decided to kind of try to get it back, and to do that, we thought, well, the reason we have this smaller switch costs, maybe because the test paradigm is kind of complicated, right? They have to switch back and forth between instructions, and holding those instructions require, additional abilities that's variable across subjects. And the candidate is likely, working memory and other, we think working memory is a good candidate. So here, what we did was we kind of shortened this time a little bit because we will not be looking at EEG here. And then we also only kept one condition. So for any subject, they only have to kind of prepare for the kind of hyper switch mode. They won't have to switch back and forth. But we also want to estimate each individual's working memory capacity to kind of get that individual differences in terms of their ability to implement the instructions. So we collect the operation span and symmetry span to estimate, kind of get an index of working memory capacity. This is kind of the working memory capacity in our sample. And from here, we were actually able to, using this modified paradigm, we were able to find the effect that we had from the very first study. Right? There's a reduction of switch costs of items associated with high switch probability compared to low switch probability. Even now we have this instruction. Okay. And then when we look at the effects of working memory, we use a linear mix modeling, kind of compare the effect. And the winning model is this full model that has many factor working memory, and then also working memory capacity interacting with the item by transition effect, which is the ISSP effect here. So the reduced model is the traditional one when you have experiment that you would have, one variable, two variable, and an interaction between the two. So, but then adding this kind of continuous individual differences score, it improve our model fit of the RT data. Okay, yeah, the coefficient from this term is negative 2.39. The negative is because, as we kind of expect, right? When you have one working memory capacity higher than whatever the mean, that means you actually have a smaller ISSP effect. Because if you think about the strategy people are using, if they are using their working memory and try to prepare for switches, then they actually would not care about which item shows up. So the item effect would actually be smaller, going the negative direction. Another way to look at the individual differences here is look at how variable their reaction time changes across trials. So here we take a RTV, response time variation. So this is just a variance of reaction time across all trials, all items, regardless switch repeat, regardless, there's only one instruction, but basically across switch repeat and across items, so all trials. And it turns out that if you have high capacity, your variation is smaller. Again, that makes sense because if you are just using your one state, hyper switches state to approach every single trial, you're probably treating every trial as a switches or, somewhat like toward the switches, and therefore you will not be so variable across trials or items. Okay. Okay, so from the second study, we can show that both expectation and experience-driven meta-control could be instantiated, somewhat kind of coexist. But their instantiation is a little bit working memory dependent. So someone with a lower capacity, because the statistic of the trial doesn't have that high versus low, it's false, right? So maybe when they have low capacity, they'll quickly just forget about the instruction we told them to do, and then just go with the statistic in the environment. Where with someone with a higher capacity, perhaps they are taking our instructions much more seriously and trying to prepare for the switches, prepare for repeats, so on and so forth. In that case, their item effect is actually smaller. Okay, questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's good, very good observation. Sorry, I should have used this one before. Okay, all right. So I'm switching to talk about Corey's work. It's slightly a different flavor. The project I'm talking about is asking, do flexibility and stability necessarily trade off at the level of task set? But before I delve into that study, I will give you a little bit of idea or examples of what I mean or where does this relate to our real life? And for that, I'm going to kind of say, let's say you go and then try to define cognitive flexibility. It turns out the definition is all over the place. There's a myriad of ways people define this, and they're not necessarily very consistent, which is kind of expected. This is a very kind of colloquial term, and unlike more experimental, operationalized definitions like that. But then I'll kind of use an example to illustrate what cognitive flexibility means. This is actually stealing from Todd Braver's idea. He studied cognitive control, and then he at one point went on to England to do his sabbatical. But if you're American and you did a sabbatical or trying to drive in the UK, you will notice like how much cognitive control it requires of you, right? Because it's on the other side of the road. You drive on the opposite side of your car. If you drive a stick shift, it's on the left, it's not on the right. So everything will seem just weird and surreal to you. Your brain will be telling you that you're doing everything wrong, and then, but you have to like constantly concentrate on this task. I would say I'm lucky. I come back to Taiwan for a place that I lived for 20-something years. But I don't think the task is any easier too. This is the map that when I left Taiwan, Taipei, the simple, three lines and MRT. But this is the state now. And then living here is different when I just come back and visit. I actually have to live here and then navigate to places. The other thing that's even challenging to me was the amount of payment method you guys have to use. I've heard that sometimes people will have like 5-6 different apps on their phone, so that they can, go to one place, pay with this 接口 something, right? And then when you go to 全联要全支付, and I'm so glad cash still works, and then because I think there were places because of COVID, cash also doesn't work, and you have to figure out how to pay. Right. So this is an illustration of when you're so used to something, and then all of a sudden things change. You don't feel that because to you guys it's incremental, right? Now this comes up, and then you add it to your kind of profile of living. And then new lines of MRT, it's gradual, but when you see the changes dramatically, it's different to get used to. So a little bit sidetracking from a kind of backstory about that work I'm going to talk about is it actually came from a kind of a review paper Corey did for his qualifying exam to become PhD candidate. At that time, he was telling me that, I look into different issues, and I found that people don't define things carefully. People don't really define what they meant by cognitive flexibility, but at the same time, they make claims about cognitive flexibility. So that there's some kind of disconnect between data and then theory, or people want to say what they want to say. So I said, yeah, go ahead and then do some literature review, and then we'll see what comes out of it. So he did that, and then as he pointed out initially, it is the case that it's all over the place. Sometimes you do see some hints of this trade-off idea. The other is, a lot of time what people take for granted is that when you have something increase in the flexibility, you automatically can say that they have decreased stability. And that's not necessarily the case in terms of empirical data. Okay, so at that time when we wrote this review paper, there were only 2 empirical work as kind of hinting to the same direction that these 2 construct might be independent. So by the time he need to graduate, I said, why don't you add some data to this piece of puzzle, and then see what we can say about it. So that's what he did when he need to graduate and find a dissertation project. We take our task switching paradigm and kind of adopted the lesson we learned from Moonsum and try to see whether we can answer this question. So I'm getting ahead of myself. So first of all, I want to explain again. So in our task switching paradigm, normally we get the switch cost in something we focus on all the time. And then we typically say when we see a change in switch cost, that can indicate a change in flexibility, right? So when you see a reduced switch cost in a context 2 compared to context 1, that seems to indicate upregulated flexibility. But at the same time with this paradigm, if you use overlapping response sets, so what that means is that for both tasks, they map to the same keys. So living, non-living map to Z and M key, and then large and small also map to Z and M key. What that means is that you'll have a stimuli that's the same response regardless of the task. A category of stimuli that's always the same key regardless of the task. Those are so-called congruent, response congruent stimuli. But you also have stimuli that are incongruent between the tasks. So in one task, you have to press M. In the other task, you have to press Z. So that gives you a kind of a maximum of interference when you're doing one of the tasks. You also have that kind of a feeling that, oh, I want to do the other task. So that's where the incongruent effect comes from. So, and then this is actually another way to look at stability that we haven't been looking at. So in asking this question, the paradigm is kind of perfect in that way that we can actually measure flexibility or do something with flexibility and look at stability and vice versa. Okay. Right, so different from the Geiger and Egner paper where they actually manipulate both things kind of orthogonally and then in a biased way. In our experiment, we actually keep it even. So it's 50% switches, repeat, 50% incongruent, congruent. But then we borrowed the lesson or we learned from Moonsong's experiment and use false instructions. So in one group of subjects, they'll be given two kinds of instructions. The first kind is similar to the Moonsong study, or these are similar. So the first instruction is you're going to see a lot of switches in the next block. Get ready for switches. But it's false because 50% switches, right? And then in the mostly repeat instruction, we tell them, hey, you're going to see a lot of repeat trials, so relax. But again, it's not true. It's still 50% switches. There's going to be another group that look at congruency, manipulate congruency. But for now, we'll look at this for the meantime. Okay. So in terms of results, I'm going to show you two indexes in the same graph. So the switch cost is what we're manipulating, okay? And then that's the flexibility aspect of the measurement. And the congruency effect is the, does that trade off with flexibility is our main question. So what we hope to see is that with the manipulation, we're successfully manipulating people's flexibility, like upregulating their, asking them to upregulate and actually upregulate. But at the same time, we want to see the congruency effect move the other direction or not. If it does move the other direction significantly, then that's a trade-off. That's supporting the trade-off hypothesis. But if not, then perhaps these two constructs are independent. Okay. So luckily in the flexibility group, we do see that. We were able to successfully manipulate flexibility groups switch cost, but we do not actually see changes in their congruency effect. So that's supported of the non-trade-off relationship as opposed to be a trade-off. Right? At the same time, we have a stability group that we told them the instruction in terms of the congruency, right? Mostly incongruent, mostly congruent. In this case, same thing. We want to see the congruency effect in upward and switch cost the other direction. However, we did not see that. So the manipulation is even not significant to start with. So there's no point to look at the second bar. Okay. And the reason we have this two group is Corey kind of have this idea that if we do able to show this in two groups, perhaps we can demonstrate something like double dissociation, a logic that borrow from the neuropsych practices where you will have something being modulated or impaired, but not the other. And a separate group, independent group of participants, you see the opposite, and then you can dissociate these two functions. But in this case, it was in this kind of experimental context. Okay, in the second study, we use a priming task to kind of regulate flexibility and stability. Specifically, we use a AUT, alternative use task, to regulate the flexibility. This task is mostly popular in problem solving, creativity research. It's believed to kind of prime or induce divergent thinking. So for instance, the task entails telling subject a word, and then they have to come up as many uses as possible, uncommon one, but still reasonable. So like if I say brick, can you think of brick for other purposes as opposed to just building houses? It can be a doorstep, it can be a support when you get hurt. You can use it to someone, just kidding. Subject can write out or type out as many uses as possible. If they type out a lot of uses, that indicate they're really thinking widely, perhaps creatively and flexibly in their thinking. On the other hand, the stability group, we gave them a remote associates test. This task is thought to foster convergent thinking, so the opposite of divergent. So they were given three words, and they had to come up with one word that connect to all three words. So anyone has an idea? Broken, clear, eye. What's the answer to this? Yeah, glasses. Right. And then when I came back here, I realized you guys do that in the 一字千金 all the time, right? Find a word that can make the other a reasonable word. And in terms of the contrast, kind of a baseline condition, we just give them a typing task. That's the same for both groups. So it's not necessary promoting divergent, convergent, or like flexibility, stability. Okay. In this experiment, this time we actually found a effect in the stability group. So, the evidence in the stability group, such that their congruency effect is manipulated or shifted as expected, but their switch cost was not changing. So that's another evidence against the trade-off hypothesis. Unfortunately, in the flexibility group, it has this funny, weird pattern. So if you look at this, you may be, oh, there is trade-off. However, we will argue that because the manipulation was not even successful, so you should not make any inferences about what happened to the trade-off at this time. Because the assumption is that, when you are able to shift their flexibility, what happened to the stability index? So again, this is a single dissociation, but this time in a stability group. So kind of interestingly, when he actually go and do the research, we found the single dissociation in separate studies, in separate groups. Okay. The other thing we could do with this big data set was to look at kind of across subject correlations. So that's what we did. We combined the a flexibility group in both studies, and just look at their indices of SC, the switch cost, and the congruency. And in this case, we do have a very weak correlation in the right kind of trade-off relationship, but again, very, very weak. Likewise, in the stability group, another kind of negative correlation, but very, very weak effect. So we think this at least is a piece of evidence suggesting that perhaps stability and flexibility are not necessarily trading off with each other. And, you do have to measure and then, check your assumptions when you talk about, at least when you use these terms. Okay, to wrap up this part, we think that it may not be a within individual phenomena, But then the kind of caveat is because we've done this in a very frequent switches environment using task switching paradigm. So again, perhaps someone did a different task that fostered different modes of processing. You could see the trade-off. But what we want to say is, at least in our scenario, you cannot just put a negative sign and say you found the opposite, right? And in terms of the last piece of correlation part, we think perhaps there is this kind of a trade-off trait. But again, I would be limited because of the small number of that correlation value. Questions, or do the online people have questions, or do they're okay? Okay. Should I go on to the next study, or should I wrap up? Go on. Keep going. Okay. This one is perhaps should be short. You used in this economic at one point. So this one was asking, can random reward promote cognitive flexibility? This is another kind of branch that Corey discovered when people are talking about flexibility very general. But there's like different ways you can improve flexibility. And Dreisbach also make a claims about like random reward functioning kind of differently from the other reward mechanisms, but without supporting evidence. So when he told me about this, I say, oh, just do a careful search again, and then make sure that it really is the case. Nobody had looked at it. And so we decided to take a shot at this. Okay, so in this simple question, we want to simply ask, can you use random reward to reduce switch cost? And then I'm using a flexibility term here, but I'll qualify that later on. This is a paradigm, again, very similar to what you've seen in the past, how you've been seeing in the past, except this time he used words, and every trial has a different word. So it's not a learning paradigm now, it's just one camel, they only see camel once. And the manipulation is that after a particular trial, there's a majority of the trial following it is nothing, but then a small number of trial, they'll get a bonus, they'll get a random reward, a picture of the gift box, and it's supposed to be really good for them. Why? Because he told participants that you're gonna start with, you have to complete a large amount of trials to get your research credit. These are the credits, right? You're gonna have to sit through 911 trials before you can get your credit, and subject does not like that, right? But occasionally you'll get a gift box, and then it's not contingent on your performance, it's random, it's just for you, it's a gift. And in that case, your trial will be reduced 10 trials. And to make it a little bit more exciting, he even count down, it start with 910, and it was just down to 900, somewhat exciting. And the idea is that what happened to the trial following the random reward, the switch versus repeat? Do we see any modulation of switch costs because of the random reward? Okay, so that's the basic first experiment manipulation. And very luckily, we actually do see a reduction of switch cost. Right, on those trials following random reward, the switch costs are reduced compared to following nothing. And we call this kind of a reward after effect to distinguish it from other kinds of motivational rewarding effects, because this happened kind of at the end of the trial and happening after that trial. Not like I told you you'll get a reward, and then you're kind of being motivated to perform in certain ways to improve your performance. This is totally kind of an after effect. But there's some problem with the first paradigm. The trial length is not quite matched. There's like a majority of nothing versus the small number of random reward. So there's some issue with the first paradigm. But from there, we kind of match things more carefully and then do additional manipulations. So in our second experiment, we compare the so-called non-contingent being the random reward with the more traditional contingent one, so the performance contingent reward. In a third experiment, we look at the eyeball. Like I say, it has a little bit of the surprise effect. So we want to see if really is the rewarding value that matters, or just anything, right? A shoe or anything, right? So in the second experiment, when we compare the contingent versus random, we again see only the after effect, the reduction of switch cost for the random reward blocks. So it's phases actually. So each participant have two phases. The first half of the experiment is random, second half is contingent, and for the other group, switched counterbalance. But for the contingent one, so they only get that trophy when they have correct and fast enough response. So they also get to reduce trials from their to-do list. But in this case, they only get these when they are fast and accurate. So that's very different from the random reward, right? They don't have to do anything particular. In this case, we don't have the reduction of switch cost. Okay. In the experiment 3A and B, we have three types of trial all mixed together, 30% each. So kind of take care of that small proportion issue in the first experiment. And in this case, we still see a reduction of switch cost in the random reward condition. But as you can see, the eyeball is also doing similar things. The differences between A and B is in A, we only told them about the eyeball and the gift box, kind of doing the main trials, like not doing practice. But in 3B, we thought that maybe we could further kind of habituate them with the eyeball during the practice. So we also show them eyeball during the practice when they're just learning the stimulus response mappings, not doing the main experiment. But in this case, it's still there. So likely the effect of random reward partly is driven, just as something visually capturing and an eyeball-ish surprise effect. Okay, so what I didn't tell you is that even though we do see this reduction of switch costs, it seems to be driven by a slowing, overall slowing. So they were this slowing on both switch and repeat trials, and there's even more. If it's differences, so it's hard to say, but it seemed to be a little bit more slowing because the repeat trial, not necessarily the switch trial, gets faster. Okay, so the slope. In any case, to be continued. We think there more work to be done, but at least this is the first time, we can make claims about what the random reward does to the switch cost. I suppose just say it might, increase flexibility or reduce switch costs. So that's where, and then after seeing the similarity with eyeballs, we think EEG can help answering this sort of question in the next study too. Okay, so that's all I have, and I will be happy to take questions or inquiries.对啊，
所以
对啊，不是只是 eyeball 而已，是 actually rewarding value. That's why we try to argue. 因为 gift box, eyeball 那个 cube, we told them that it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't reduce your number of trials in the experiment, and like it doesn't. The meaning is different from knowing that you're gonna get something because of the gift box. Well, the other thing is because I'm showing you switch cost in a contingent reward one, they are being fast right? So they actually work against switch costs, reducing switch cost, because they are very fast for the repeat. They're trying to be fast for the switch too. So the difference is actually smaller, and you can see it at, actually they're very fast for the repeat to be accurate. They're trying to be accurate on a switch trial, so they're actually slower a little bit. So the switch cost would actually be larger in that case. It's a mix in the literature too. When people actually look at performance contingent effect on switch cost, it's like sometimes increase, sometimes decrease, because people are adjusting because of performance, and then it's a difference.
stability 跟 flexibility， 那个 stability 的定义到底是什么？
我们是用 congruency， right？ 如果你只有 single task 的时候 ，if you have interference, kind of like Stroop effect, right? Stroop effect, people are told to name the ink， 所以只有一种 task。可是呢，你的 reading is so automatic, it's providing a lot of interference. So in Stroop task, the incongruent trials are slower, and then congruent trials are faster, right? So congruency effect have been thought of as a how well you are able to stay on task, stay on single task. It's not very common to look at that in task switching paradigms, but it's actually there. So as an opportunity, when we did all of earlier study, people often ask about congruency effect, and at that time we didn't quite realize, that's actually a stability measure, because it's not traditionally a stability measure. Yeah. 君宇。
好，谢谢雨晴老师。感觉 generally，是不是认知弹性 cognitive flexibility 越高是好事？然后最后就想说怎么样帮助？那我想先问一个是比较连回生活可能的应用，就是现在这种 paradigm 的效果大概可以持续多久？有没有往这方向看？
Very good question. For a while, that's yeah, for a while, that's what Corey's goal, to kind of see how this regulated flexibility can be a transfer effect and all that. But we found that it's limited. It transfer to very similar things, similar contexts. Like you can say the list-wise effect is a form of transfer to the 50% items. But then if you want to transfer to a totally different task, it doesn't necessarily work. There's another paper he did on this question, and the reason is because the mechanism that give rise to this regulated or increased flexibility or reduced switch costs, we think is because you're just doing concurrent activation of two tasks. So only these two tasks are getting the benefit of this context, and then any other things, because they are not learned in that environment, it's less likely to have an effect. So inside the laboratory, you can, so very limited.
今天来做这个 test， 然后明天再来做一次，或是隔几天， 然后刺激如果图片改不同的，是不是？
Yeah, I think Sana Brand, he tried to do that, and then he tried to train subject in, when doing training, even have a little bit variable in the context, so that, because this is kind of like double-edged thing, right? The more you train with a similar thing, the better you are, but then the less likely you can generalize, because it's like the skill acquisition. You want it to be very precise, but then it's rigid. Just coming back to the initial one, I framework, right? The automatic thing is not supposed to be flexible. And then flexible is hard to generalize. Automatic is, automatic is hard to be flexible and generalizable. So it's limited in some ways. even with this kind of variable training. I think, long term, it could have an effect, but a lot of time due to resources, you can't just like train it on. So it's hard to do that.
可能也有点关系，就跟刚刚讲，最后如果变 automatic 或是某种 process 的改变，就是不知道你们有没有看过，就是从像 priming 或是 repetition suppression 的角度看这些事情。
The literature has some about that, like can these effects simply be explained with priming? Right? But you could still demonstrate this similar idea with one-shot stimuli, one-time learning, one-time experience. So there's something, but then it's kind of different levels. So, but the priming could be like very at different levels too. So yeah.
Yeah. 我可能也没有觉得可以完全用那个解释啊，但只是是在想这样的 paradigm 是可以看到有人拿来用在像 priming 的 paradigm，那我会也蛮好奇可能会看到什么。看起来好像这边还没有 FMI 的 data 嘛。
对，你说哪一类的？
比如说像第一部分的，就举例来说，就是有一类的研究，他们是在看出现，比如说同样的图片，一只狗，那yes， 如果是 perceptual priming 的角度，可能会觉得同样的图片会 process 更快，但是分得更细之下，像那个 Anthony Wagner 或是Nick Rock 他们有在分一层一层，其实那个 priming 有可能是知觉层次，有可能是 decision 层次，比如说刚刚是判断 living non-living 或是判断 larger smaller， 然后也有可能是 response 的层次，然后甚至是他们连在一起的这个层次。那这边学到的是什么？我觉得蛮有趣。然后在 FMI 可能会预期，比如说某种程度是会有相应脑区的 repetition suppression。那我感觉还是没办法完全解释，就是刚刚讲这个 switch 或 flexibility， 但是可能有一点关联是在不同的 context， 就是刚刚那个 priming 的效果有可能是在这个 context 学会的，它才有那个效果，然后换 context 又不一样，感觉这好像会有一点关系。
Yeah, I agree. We just haven't got there. 但是我刚刚想到的是什么东西？结果讲一讲忘记啊。Yeah, 我忘记。But I understand what you're talking about, and yeah, never mind. When I remember what I was thinking, I'll tell you.
谢谢，等一下我们可以再聊。
Yeah, 我突然间有点想起来，there are different levels, right? So actually related. So early studies when they demonstrate actually in Stroop paradigm, and then there's a big pushback that all these are just stimulus response association, nothing higher level. And the reason we use all incompatible items is hopefully to get around that because they have to do different response in different tasks. But like I said, the reviewer didn't like it, and so we earlier did argue that this effect is not just SR association, perhaps like a little bit higher level. But I think a lot of times, even with repetition, you can argue that it's just almost becoming like a stimulus, and then that task and the context, everything together as a response. So it's beyond just like the motor response, but it's like that integrated response. And so that is not necessary control anymore, I think, in my way of thinking of control. But that's why it's kind of like when we use these terms, it's a bit like, what do you really mean by control and automatic, right? Well, how do you define something that's truly automatic? One of my colleagues he looked at my study and then just one session, and then with this repeated experience, he doesn't think that's automaticity. He thinks that you have to bring people in the lab and for like 5 sessions, and that's automaticity. It depends on the levels of what you're talking about and what you're trying to make claims about, I think.
老师好，我是心理系硕士班的学生。那我好奇说，因为在这个 test switching 的这个 paradigm， 通常会 switch cause 还可以分成像是 mixed cause 这个 mixed repeat 减single repeat， 所以比较好奇说，为什么老师今天谈的都比较是在 只有 switch cause 部分，然后就是再接续这个就是说。因为像通常 mixed cause 会作为这个 cognitive flexibility 的指标，那 switch cause 会作为这个switch cause 会作为 flexibility 的指标，所以可是这个定义好像又跟老师今天报的定义会稍微有点不同，所以想厘清一下这个 flexibility 跟 stability 的定义。
Yeah, I would say when I use these in here, and it's just our definition for flexibility. There's just too many ways you can define flexibility. And there's not a consensus in the literature either. If you look at the, just Google search, sometimes you can find definition that's almost just like a definition for cognitive control. But for us, we want to say, flexibility is actually control in different contexts. So there's another level of like regulation, but not everyone agree with us. So when we write paper, we're actually much more careful when what we meant by this term versus that. And for mixed cost, it's for simplicity issue. We didn't have a block of single task to estimate like mixing costs and all that, because that's more kind of asking mechanism underlying like test set. And so for simplicity reasons, we just kind of stick with just having this paradigm, and then within the same block, switch versus repeat. There's no baseline to be honest, right? There's not really when we say switch cost, is it really the switch trial getting faster or repeat trial getting slower? Sometimes we actually see both scenarios. When we see switch cost reduction, it could be a slowing of the repeat trial or actually a speeding up of the switch trial. So it's a little bit tricky to claim things from there. But in terms of that measurement, we can still say our manipulation modulated this measurement that we're looking at. Yeah, so that's the simple reason why it's not in. So hopefully that's.
非常精彩的实验哦。那我想要就是请教最后一个那个实验的部分，关于那个 random reward 的部分。那个地方我有一点就是在思考说，这种 reward 的本质是什么？就是说，它其实是真的他拿到什么东西吗？其实他并没有真的多拿到什么东西，所以他只是少付出一点代价。所以少付出一点代价跟 random reward 的概念其实有一点点不太一样，就像对小朋友来说，他少写几题数学，跟他可以多吃冰淇淋是不太一样的概念。所以我在好奇说，如果因为你现在的实验是用那个普星拿 credit 的方式，所以他只能够拿一样的 reward。那如果把它真的改成说，他可以真的多得到多少钱，会不会那个效果更明显？尤其是在那个 contingent 的那个条件之下，因为对 contingent 的这个条件，在这种情形之下，他应该是没有办法拿到更多的东西，所以他没有那么 exciting 想要去做这个 task， 他就好吧，如果我达到这个标准，顶多是这样。那所以这是一个可能性，就是说，会不会这样子做会比较能够看出更多的效果？那另外一个是就是在想说反过来，就是说， 那如果是 punishment 呢
Yeah.
？punishment 会有什么样的效果？会不会 random punishment 也还是会有类似的效果，或是不会？因为我是在想一个事情，就是说它到底是真的是 reward 还是一个 unexpected 的东西？像您刚才也提到说，会出现一个 oddball 是一个 unexpected 的，所以会不会它是一种 arousal level 的提升，而让它产生的这个效果？
Yeah,
这样。
excellent point. So the other reason why people haven't used this kind of manipulation is two things. One is people are more interested in, if you get a random reward, you probably just have affect effect, like positive affect. People are actually more interested in positive affect modulating control, like showing pictures, priming like positive mood, and then having a modulating your proactive versus reactive control. So that's one reason. But then, you know, when people want to say random reward, but then look at affect, we think it's still two things. And yeah. The other thing is we did try money at one point. The second experiment was with money, but because the subject pool, if you say you get extra $1 to, they actually don't really care that much. You know, they want to hear to get credits. And then what we thought, and then there were some strange reasons that our pool doesn't like us to give reward, like kind of, I can't remember why, but then I thought, well, they want to get out of the experiment quickly, right? So just let them feel like they can get out and still get the credit. That's still a reward. This is just a negative reinforcement. No. 算吗？算 negative just yeah, negative reinforcement, right? Is it negative? But negative reinforcement is punishment. 是负。对，只是 negative 的拿掉什么东西，对。Yeah. So in other work, Moon-san had actually looked at more punishment effects in her dissertation. She had looked at if you change your instruction to say, if you don't do it correctly, then I'll add trials. Then that's that they actually hate that. Like improve performance a lot. so to some extent, you know, like, but then I think back in the days, if you look at literature, most people look at giving extra money and then thinking that it's very motivating. But I would actually put a question mark for if you just use subject pools, right? And then also like people don't like to use punishment, like either you use shock or, you know, but adding trial is like really not IRB would not have trouble with that, right? So it's easier to get approved, but then you can still motivate subject to do certain things, and that actually hasn't been looked at a lot in our niche field, just because, you know, people were thinking about reward punishment in a very traditional way, I think. Yeah, and then you were asking something about arousal. Yeah. So the point of random reward. The other construct that's often linked to flexibility, stability is this exploratory behavior versus exploitative behavior. So that's what Corey initially was kind of interesting. Like if you prime people to be more exploratory, would you get this flexibility regulation too? And then random reward seems to be inducing some kind of curiosity, if you will, right? Why am I getting this? They say it's random, but maybe it's not. And then like they're kind of, you know, either very happy because the affect, because they're getting something out of it, or they're just like curious. And that's kind of like, we can't make claims now, but that's kind of a backstory. Like perhaps it's getting a sense of the exploratory mode of behavior. Does that touch the question? If there was a question there.
老师你好，谢谢你的影响。我是那个德佑老师的博士生。那我 虽然刚刚有提到，就是在你这个研究里面算就是它可能不完全是一个很完整的那个 automatic process， 所以它在做 Metacontrol 的时候可能跟那种会有一点不一样。但是我好奇的是，老师可不可以就依你到目前的研究，然后还有你自己的这一些读过的 paper， 你能不能提出一些 speculation， 就是它这样子的，就是这种你今天来这种 single section 的，跟那种我们比较长期所谓的比如说真的是 habit， 或者是甚至有所谓 implicit memory 这种所谓的这种automatic process， 我们在做 meta control 的时候，它 require 的 neural mechanism 是不是相同的，或者是如果是不同的话，可能跟什么有关？如果是相同的话，那它是只是 require 更多的，比如说frontal 的resource 而已嘛？就是看老师你觉得现在比较支持哪一边？
I don't have an answer. 应该是说，我觉得很多时候也还没有被研究啊。那因为从比较传统 automaticity 的人看，他就会觉得说这个还根本就不到 automaticity 的程度。那当然 automaticity 的人有他们觉得什么样的情况会达到 automaticity 的这个理论。那这个就我对他们来讲完全是，然后他们也当然有相关的一些 brain mechanism. Actually, there's a really long line, a big literature on that. And to some extent, that's one of my colleagues' expertise. And then we're still like kind of talking to each other, like coming from his angle versus me, a very cognitive control person, like where do we see the connection? And there's still a lot of work to be done, so I don't have a strong opinion or speculation of whether these are overlapping mechanisms or, perhaps there's similar route of processing that's mediating both. I don't know, but to some extent, some of our work does look at the neural mechanism of the item-specific effect, and we will argue that it's also using some of the circuits that's learning-based. So that's at least a similar idea underlying both, because the automaticity just really coming from like learning and repetition. But yeah. For you to work on if you need topics. Yeah, so it's pretty much a mixture of associative learning and control state. So the way I would say it is the stimuli linking with control demands, and control demand being such as switching, but you could also have other demands like response inhibition, but that's actually very response based, right? Or like attention mode, particular like focus attention mode or diffuse attention mode, whatever that's a higher level up than the response. Does that make sense? So the co-occurrence of a stimuli and then context, yeah, that's the word sometimes I context being time, places, items, those are all context, location, or a combination of one of those things, and the control demand being, from the cognitive control to taxonomy, right? The switching, updating, those operations. If those two things co-occur frequently in your experience, that's when we think that you can have this meta control emerged. Huh? Well, the meta control actually come from the question of what controls cognitive control. What is controlling the cognitive control? And broadly I would say the learning is controlling cognitive control to some extent. Because the traditional view is cognitive control is very like situation based or goal based. There's no learning in it. So people have been asking then, how do you regulate control? But then when you say regulate control, it's like regulate control across time, across places, across contexts, right? So then there's this opportunity for repetition of similar things, repetition of similar demands, repetition of other bottom-up stimuli. But it turns out, the twist is that you can also instruct people, because the way you've been thinking is probably all kind of experience driven, right? But it turns out that we also had the ability to kind of prepare ourselves to be in certain modes of control. Not just the control, but certain modes of control. Like I illustrate, right? Frequent switches, it's kind of a mode of processing. It's not just the switch per se, like the control act per se, but like frequent switches or frequent something, right? Frequent inhibition, if you will. Right?
好，谢谢邱老师。然后我们心理系有特别要准备一个小礼物，感谢邱老师。
对，谢谢大家给我这个机会，谢谢杨正达教授让我有机会在这。那我有时候也会来他的实验室，所以如果你们有想要找我聊天，可以再联络。好，谢谢大家。
今天一样在等一下旁边教室有准备那个点心跟就是可以再跟邱老师交流一下这样。对，会要